When we hear the term self-esteem, what comes to mind? Some may be thinking self-esteem, well, that's just psychobabble. You know, even discussing it, you might as well just get off the stage. What a waste of time. Others may be thinking, well, the first word in self-esteem is self. And self is the problem, so we shouldn't even consider it. Why are you wasting our time? Others may be thinking about their own lives and how they struggle with their self-image, their self-esteem. They feel inadequate around others, and at times it hurts. But they don't talk about it because maybe they feel they cannot. I would like to read from verywellmind.com in an article entitled, "What is Self-Esteem?" In psychology, the term self-esteem is used to describe a person's overall sense of self-worth or personal value. In other words, how much you appreciate and like yourself. Self-esteem is often seen as a personality trait, which means that it tends to be stable and enduring. Self-esteem can involve a variety of beliefs about yourself, such as the appraisal of your appearance, beliefs, emotions, and behaviors. The article goes on, the need for self-esteem plays an important role in psychologist Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which depicts self-esteem as one of the basic human motivations. Maslow suggests that people need both self-esteem from other people as well as inner self-respect. Both these needs must be fulfilled in order for an individual to grow as a person and to achieve self-actualization. A further definition can be as follows, which is taken from Psychology Today with an article entitled, "What is Self-Esteem?" Confidence in one's value as a human being is a precious psychological resource and generally a highly positive factor in life. It is correlated with achievement, good relationships, and satisfaction. Possessing little self-regard can lead people to become depressed, to fall short of their potential, or to tolerate abusive situations and relationships. Too much self-love, on the other hand, results in an off-putting sense of entitlement and an inability to learn from failures. It can also be a sign of clinical narcissism in which individuals may behave in a self-centered, arrogant, and manipulative manner. Perhaps no other self-help topic has spawned so much advice and so many, often conflicting, theories. The article goes on. Self-esteem can influence life in myriad ways, from academic to professional, success to relationships and mental health. Self-esteem, however, is not an immutable characteristic. Successes or setbacks, both personal and professional, can fuel the fluctuations in the feeling of self-worth. Each individual's experience is different, but over the course of the lifespan, self-esteem seems to rise and fall in predictable, systematic ways. Research suggests that self-esteem grows by varying degrees until age 60, where it remains steady before beginning to decline in old age. In other words, self-esteem has to do with how we think about ourselves and how we value ourselves. But when we view the Bible, isn't self the problem? Let's take a look at a few scriptures that point this out. 2 Timothy 3, verse 1. 2 Timothy 3, verse 1. 2 Timothy 3, verse 1. And we'll read verse 1 and then the first part of verse 2. But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, At the end of the age of man, before the return of Jesus Christ, men will be lovers of themselves. Isn't that what self-esteem is all about? Loving oneself? Isn't the idea that we focus on self-esteem results in people becoming self-absorbed and self-centered, lovers of themselves, just as Paul prophesied? In fact, don't we see in Scriptures that we're not to think highly of ourselves? Turn to Romans 12, verse 3, and we'll read the first half of verse 3. Romans 12, verse 3. Romans 12, verse 3. It states in Romans 12, verse 3, the first half, "For I say, though the grace given to me to everyone is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think." And isn't our daily walk a walk of denying ourselves? Turn to Mark 8, verse 34. Mark 8, verse 34. Mark 8, verse 34. And it states in Mark 8, verse 34, "When he had called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said unto them, Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up the cross and follow me." Let's also turn to Romans 3. Romans 3, verse 10. Romans 3, verse 10. Romans 3, verse 10. "As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. There is none that does good, no, not one." However, is that the view God wants from ourselves, about the family, about the children He is calling at this time? Yet it can be confusing to read these scriptures, and then we turn to Mark 12, verse 30. Mark 12, verse 30. And we're familiar with these scriptures. Mark 12, verse 30 to 31. Mark 12, verse 30 to 31. And it states in verse 30, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and all your mind, and all your strength. And this is the first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." And this principle of loving others as ourselves was nothing new to those who heard this. Indeed, he was only repeating what's found in Leviticus 19, verse 18, where it states, "You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." For today's message, I would like to examine the concept of self-esteem in the Bible. How should we view ourselves as we go through our journey? And for those who would like to have a title, it is Self-Esteem and the Bible. Now, to begin with, we will not find the term self-esteem in the Bible. In the Strong's Concordance of the King James Version of the Bible, we'll find esteem, esteemed, esteemeth, or esteeming. And it's more, these words are more used, the word esteem is more in relation of how we view things or how we view others. For example, to esteem others better than ourselves is found in Philippians 2, verse 3. Or a man esteems one day over another, Romans 14, verse 5. However, the Bible does discuss how we are to look at ourselves. We just read Mark 12:31 and Leviticus 19, verse 18, that we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. But if we don't have a good opinion of ourselves, if we view ourselves as no good, as worthless, how can we do that? Does the use of the term self automatically negate any value to the term self-esteem or self-worth? Just because we use the word self, it has no relevance in our life today. Is that how it works? One aspect of the definition of self-esteem notes that self-esteem is a person's overall subjective emotional evaluation to his or her own worth. Therefore, someone with low self-esteem considers himself to be worth little, whereas someone with high self-esteem considers himself to have great worth. Much of humanity derives its self-esteem from such things as wealth, appearance, strength, occupation, popularity, celebrity, and relationships. And inevitably and unfortunately, the self-esteem of these individuals who focus on these matters rises and falls based on personally how they're doing in these respective categories, especially as they compare themselves to others. Many in our society place extreme value on outward appearance. They value youth, beauty, athletic ability, intelligence, education, wealth, and fame. But what happens when someone loses it? They have it all, and it's gone. What happens where a person who had an active lifestyle one day finds himself restricted to a wheelchair? What happens when a supermodel loses her youth? What happens when a person has a debilitating stroke? What happens when the perfect family ends up in divorce? What happens when someone has a great career and then one day loses it? If wealth, appearance, strength, occupation, popularity, celebrity relationships are important, if they comprise the basis of our feelings of esteem and self-worth, our self-image, then what happens when everything on which we have, on everything which we base our value, vanishes? There's a danger of self-esteem, self-worth based on physical things, on outward appearances. And within church culture, we can also put a value on outward appearances. You're probably thinking, no, we don't. No, we don't. But consider these questions. Young adults, is there something wrong with someone who's single and not married? The rest of the congregation, if we have someone who here has never been married, are they a failure? Is it more prestigious to be an elder or a deacon than not? If someone who has committed a visible sin, maybe someone who has left God's way of life for a while and returned, are they a lesser person, a person of lesser stature when they return? And before you answer no, I would like for all of us to really consider that question. We shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that they're not people who may be fearful of returning because they're afraid of how they'll be judged. Is someone who's struggling a lesser Christian than one that seems to have it all together? Well, at least they have it all together at church. Being swayed by outward appearances is not something new for the church. Turn to James 2, verse 1. Turn to James 2, verse 1. James 2, verse 1. James 2, verse 1. My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down at my feet, have you not then made distinctions amongst yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Verse 5, listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? But if you have dishonored the poor man, are not the rich ones who will oppress you? And the ones who drag you into court, are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called? Verse 8, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing well. But if you show partiality, you're committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. If we are swayed by outside appearances, if we value one person over another because they seem to be more successful or they're better looking, then we need to ask ourselves how much of that view, how we view others, how we view success has impacted our view of ourselves, our self-esteem, and our self-worth. In addition, when we consider the term self-esteem, is a healthy self-image a bad thing? Does God expect us to live a life of virtual penance, self-loathing, self-hatred? When we heard the word self, we may have been ingrained that the idea of a healthy self-image is somehow bad. So, does God want us to go around loathing ourselves, to live with a cloud over our heads? I remember hearing a message when I was a teen at church, and the speaker said, we were nothing but worms. Is that the view we should have? We're worms to God? As we continue to examine this topic of self-esteem in the Bible, I would like us to consider 4 factors that impact our self-esteem, the image of ourself. The first factor that influences how we view ourselves is Satan's influence in this world. Satan's influence in this world. Turn to 1 Peter 5, verse 8. 1 Peter 5, verse 8. First Peter 5, verse 8. It states, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. We are being called to be diligent and alert. Why? Because Satan is out there and aims to undermine our confidence, to sow discord, to get us to stop believing, to become self-destructive. A lion feels no pity for its prey. It feels no compassion before the kill and experiences no remorse afterwards. There is an adversary out there, and it can impact and cloud how we view ourselves. And we must not ever forget that. A second factor that influences how we view ourselves is our own thought processes. Our own thought processes. Jeremiah 17, verse 9, and we're familiar with this scripture, but I'd still like to turn there. Jeremiah 17, verse 9. The second factor that influences how we view ourselves, our own thought processes. Jeremiah 17, verse 9. It states in Jeremiah 17, verse 9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Our thoughts can deceive us. How many times have we been in a situation where we thought we knew the whole thing? We knew we had all the answers, we were upset, maybe we got offended, we got hurt, only to find out that when all the facts were presented, we were mistaken, and we feel foolish. We can have an image of ourselves. We can be viewing ourselves and have that image, and it's totally false. Yet in our minds, we believe it's totally true. You have probably heard the phrase, perception is reality. In other words, what a person thinks what happened, even if it didn't happen that way, is still real to that person. It's their reality, even if the facts don't back up what that person is thinking. In their mind, it's real. Our self-image, our self-esteem, our self-worth can be tainted by our own perceptions, our own reality. We could be deceiving ourselves about ourselves. The third factor that influences how we view ourselves is our own physical situation. Our own physical situation. It could be medical, financial, etc. We can think of a host of things. Our self-worth, our self-image can be influenced by events going on in our lives at the time. When things are going well, we may delude ourselves into having a false sense of self. We're doing pretty good. Life is good. Look how good it is. Look how well I've done. I must be being blessed. God must be pleased with me. This is where pride creeps in and clouds judgment. Conversely, when things are not going well, when we're ill, when we're struggling financially, or when things are not working out the way we thought they would in our lives, or the lives of those we love, it can cause us to be negative on ourselves, to become discouraged, distraught, and we find ourselves in the vortex of self-criticism. I'd like to read the following, Why Esteem is Important for Mental Health, the National Alliance on Mental Illness by Ann Gould, July 12, 2016. Glenn Schiraldi, PhD, author of the Self-Esteem Workbook, describes healthy self-esteem as a realistic, appreciative opinion of oneself. He writes, unconditional human worth assumes that each of us is born with all the capacities needed to live life fruitfully, although everyone has a different mix of skills which are different levels of development. He emphasizes the core worth is independent of externals that the marketplace values, such as wealth, education, health, and status, or the way one has been treated. Some navigate the world in relationships searching for a bit of any evidence to validate their self-limiting beliefs. Much like judge and jury, they constantly put themselves on trial and sometimes sentence themselves to a life of self-criticism. A fourth factor that influences the way we view ourselves, our environment. Our environment, how life has impacted us along the way. In our journey from young to old, we will have things in our environment that will definitely influence who we are. For example, if we grow up in a very strong nuclear family, we'll reap the benefits of the nurturing relationships in our lives. And we might not even realize how much it has benefited us. But there's also other environmental factors that can influence our lives. And we can also be unaware of the impact it has on it. It can impact how we view ourselves. It can impact how we view our others. With this in mind, I'd like to read you 10 traits of an adult who experienced a certain environmental factor as a child. I will reveal the situation, the environmental factor, after I read the 10 traits. And before I read all these traits, I want to point out that the individual who experienced this situation as a child may not exhibit all these traits, but they do exhibit some of them. It makes an impact on their lives, and it makes an impact on those around them. How they view themselves is important. Considering that recent statistics indicate 28 million Americans have experienced this situation, and 11 million children under the age of 18 do now, there's a good chance that there are those here in this audience who this applies to. This person, these people, may not even realize that some of the characteristics they exhibit may be a result of this particular experience, why they act in a certain way. The 10 traits of the individual who grew up in the situation are as follows. 1, they are more concerned with others than themselves. 2, they have difficulty following a project through beginning to end. Number 3, they exhibit black and white, all or nothing thinking. Number 4, they have difficulty in having fun. They feel they don't deserve it. Number 5, they judge themselves harshly. Number 6, they constantly seek approval because as a child, approval was erratic. Number 7, they feel different from others, that no one understands them. Number 8, they love those who need rescuing. Number 9, they feel guilty for standing up to themselves, for themselves. And number 10, they're extremely loyal even in the face that the loyalty is undeserved. Can you guess what this situation is that these adults lived through as a child? Their environment was so powerful that it impacts them into adulthood. And you can imagine it impacts how this person views themselves. Again, it's not that individuals who grew up in this environment exhibits all these traits, but they do, to one extent or another, exhibit some, maybe even all. Through God's Spirit and sometimes with the help of professionals or self-help groups, these individuals can overcome the negative impact of these traits. However, the fact is, they exist. And for these individuals, these traits can influence how they view themselves, and they may not even be aware of it. So who are these people? Who do those 10 traits apply to? They are children of an alcoholic parent. My question is, how aware are we? How much aware are we of the environment that has shaped us? Our self-image, our self-worth, our self-esteem. We only covered one situation. What about others? These 4 factors, Satan's influence in the world, our own thought processes, our current physical situation, and our environment can all impact how we view ourselves. And sometimes we can be unaware of the level of that impact. We see these factors, but what's our responsibility? As I mentioned earlier, Jeremiah 17, verse 9, the heart is deceitful. Yet we see in Psalms another admonition with regard to our hearts, our thought process. Let's turn to, in Proverbs. Turn to Proverbs 4, verse 23. Proverbs 4, verse 23. Proverbs 4, verse 23. States, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it springs the issues of life. The New Living Translate renders the scripture as follows. Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. We have a responsibility to guard what we think, not to be swayed by Satan, not be swayed by the destructive and self-destructive at times ways of this world. We need to be cognizant of how much our environment has influenced our thinking about ourselves. We are to guard our minds, what we think, because if we don't, we can deceive ourselves. There are forces and influence that can lead us down a destructive path. But we are not alone in this battle. We have God's Spirit to help us in this journey. In fact, through our relationship with God, we have a new way of thinking, and we can combat the negative influences around us. So now to the crux of the question regarding self-esteem in the Bible. How are we to view ourselves? Let's go to Jeremiah 1, verse 1, please. Jeremiah 1, verse 1. Jeremiah 1, verse 1. It states in Jeremiah 1, verse 1, "These are the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, one of the priests from the town of Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. The Lord first gave messages to Jeremiah during the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. The Lord's message continued through the reign of King Jehoiakim, Josiah's son, until the 11th year, the reign of King Zedekiah, another of Josiah's sons. In August of that 11th year, the people of Jerusalem were taken away as captives. And the Lord gave me this message, verse 5, I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart and appointed you as prophet to the nations. O sovereign Lord, I said, I can't speak for you, I'm too young. The Lord replied, don't say I'm too young. For you must go wherever I send you and say whatever I tell you. And don't be afraid of the people, for I will be with you and protect you. I, the Lord, have spoken. In this passage from Jeremiah, the thing we see is an accurate view of ourselves comes from an understanding of God's view of who we are. When God told Jeremiah that he valued him and planned to use him in his life, Jeremiah protested. He was only a child. Could not possibly be of value to God. But God said, don't say I'm only a child. You must go everywhere I send you and say whatever I command you. God had plans for Jeremiah he could not understand. Jeremiah saw himself as having no value, what we might consider low self-esteem. But God saw him as one had great value. His value was not on how he saw himself or even on how others have saw him. His value was in how God saw him. Likewise, we might not be much in our own estimation, but does it matter? But isn't it the important factor is how God views us and how we are viewed by God? With this in mind, I'd like to examine some scriptures with regard to how God views his children. Psalm 139, and I'd like to read from the New Living Bible. I'd like to read verses 1 through 18, if I may. Psalm 139, verses 1 to 18. Follow along from the New Living Bible. Psalm 139. Verse 1, O Lord, you have examined my heart and know everything about me. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel. When I rest at home, you know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord. You go before me and follow me. You place your hand of blessing on my head. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too great for me to understand. I can never escape your spirit. I can never get away from your presence. If I were to go to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave, you are there. If I ride the wings of the morning, if I dwell by the farthest oceans, Even your hand will guide me, and your strength will support me. I could ask the darkness to hide me and the light around me to become night, but even in darkness I cannot hide from you. To you the night shines as bright as day. Darkness and light are the same to you. Verse 13. You made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. How well I know it. You watched me as I was being formed in utter seclusion, as I was woven together in the dark of the womb. You saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day has passed. Verse 17, how precious are your thoughts about me, O God. They cannot be numbered. I can't even count them. They outnumber the grains of sand. And when I wake up, you are still with me. The verses we read in Psalms 139 leaves no doubt that we, every one of us, are special. We are created by God, and He paid attention to the details. We are unique. We are individuals, and God knows our uniqueness. Turn to Luke 12, verse 6. Luke 12, verse 6. Luke 12, verse 6. It states, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 copper coins? And not one of them is forgotten before God. But the very hairs on your head are numbered. Do not fear, therefore. You are more value than many sparrows. These verses, Scripture shows that we matter to God. God has a plan for our lives. He's involved in our lives before we were born. He knows us so well that something so insignificant as hairs on our head are numbered. Ephesians 2, verse 10. Ephesians 2, verse 10. Ephesians 2, verse 10. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. The New International Version uses the term handiwork for workmanship. The International Standard Version and New Living Translation translates workmanship as masterpiece. Do we view ourselves as God's masterpiece? 1 Corinthians 3, verse 16. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 16. Do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells with you? When we're down on ourselves, when we go through those times of self-doubt and painful views of ourselves, when we think we have little or no value, we should consider the scriptures we've just read. We are God's workmanship, His handiwork, His masterpiece. We are the temple of God, and the Spirit of God dwells in it. It's a far cry from being worms. We also know that God is at work with us and faithful to complete that work. Turn to Philippians 1, verse 3. Philippians 1, verse 3. Philippians 1, verse 3. It states in Philippians 1, verse 3, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine making request for you with all joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. Turn to 1 Peter 2, verse 9. 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 But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of the darkness to this marvelous light. We were made for the glory of God, and that is the basis of our self-esteem, our self-worth, our self-image. Unfortunately, sometimes those in God's family think that to live a life of truly honoring God, it must be self-sacrificial, constantly punishing ourselves for faults and frailties. That if somehow we don't view ourselves as scum of the earth, then we doubt our humility. That perspective is just plain inaccurate. I propose that true humility is having an accurate view of oneself. Of course, we understand that we fall short, that we all make mistakes, but we also understand we've been blessed with gifts as well, and we have a responsibility to share those gifts, to help others, to encourage others. And through it all, through the tough times and the good times, we are special to God. We are his creation. We are his children. We rely on his guidance, his support as we go through our journey of serving him and serving others, of putting God and others above ourselves. We should be looking to God for our identity rather than our own standards. Remember, the heart is deceitful. Our standard could be flawed. We could have gone through environmental matters, situations that skew our thinking. We should not also judge our own worth as compared to others. It's flawed. Genesis 1, verse 31. Genesis 1, verse 31. Genesis 1, verse 31. States in Genesis 1:31, then God saw everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day, the day man was created. God viewed his creation as very good. We are his creation. So let me ask this question. When we belittle ourselves, are we effectively belittling God and his creation? We don't need to go to the other extreme either. We should not allow our self-image to turn into self-focus, making a god of ourselves and placing our desires above all else. We can become full of pride, blind, and lost. Romans 12, verse 3. Romans 12, verse 3. Romans 12, verse 3. For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. When we consider how God views us, we won't be filled with pride or arrogance, but with awe, with appreciation, with wonder. And we do so soberly and with humility. As we conclude this message, let's turn to 1 Peter 5, verse 6. 1 Peter 5, verse 6. states in 1 Peter 5, verse 6, "Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you." Having a correct self-image, having proper self-esteem is based on humility in the sight of God. It is understanding our great need for God and appreciating his great love for us. It is rejoicing in his truth and living it, aware of our value to him through our identity with Jesus Christ. Doesn't mean we don't have shortcomings or make mistakes. Even Paul in Romans 7:24 expressed his frustration when he said, "O wretched man that I am." And at times we will go through those situations. We're frustrated with our actions and our thoughts. Yes, we will stumble. Yes, we will fall. Yes, we will get up because we have repentance. And through it all, through all the good times, through all the tough times, we are special in God's sight.